show. Today we are getting together to discuss the recent Apache Forge vulnerability. Specifically, this is going to be a CXO's guide. We're going to be a business, not very technical review and discussion of what CXOs and CISOs can do about this particular vulnerability. I'm joined today by two security experts. First is Wendy Whitmore, who is the Senior Vice President of Unit 42 at Palo Alto Networks, and has had a long history in terms of incident response, threat research, and now runs our threat research and incident response here at Palo Alto Networks. In addition, we have Ankur Shah, who's the SVP of Prisma Cloud and product management at Prisma Cloud. So a good set of people to talk to today. So Wendy, I'm going to start with you. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Let's start with a simple question. What is the vulnerability itself? How critical is it?
Yeah, hi Rob. Thanks everyone for joining us. Looking forward to chatting today. But for anyone who's not as familiar with it, Log4j is a commonly used library for logging error messages in Java-based applications. So ultimately, a significant number of these applications are exposed to the internet and certainly subject to attack as a result of this vulnerability. Some of the challenges are that it's unknown who's had access to this vulnerability prior to disclosure. And so we're working with organizations to, as quickly as possible, identify which devices and applications are exposed and close those as quickly as possible so that we can prevent further exposure.
Okay, let's ask you, how exploitable is it? How concerned should companies be about this particular vulnerability?
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for joining. On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being really bad, unfortunately, this is 5 in terms of exploitability. Obviously, number one reason why this is pretty severe is how widespread Log4j component is. If you're a Java developer, chances are that you're using this component, so it's pretty widespread. It's exploitable because the way and how a bad actor can get in is simply send a HTTP request to your application with a certain type of payload. The application is going to receive it and then have the application point to a directory server that's controlled by the malicious actor, and then they can download any malicious piece of code and have pretty much unfettered access to the machine. So this is kind of like the shell shock that we saw back in 2014. I haven't seen anything like this for a long time.
So, Wendy, how do we explain this to higher ups at the company in non-technical terms, in terms of its impact and just as Ankur put it, it's a big one.
Yeah, I think the most significant part, Rob, is really the future impact, right? So today, the importance is in taking actions to identify where vulnerable devices and applications exist and then securing those as quickly as possible. But we're doing that to prevent further downstream impact, which really could be quite extensive in terms of threat actors, whether they're opportunistic threat actors, whether they're financially motivated cyber criminals, or typically worst case nation state actors that have either had access to this for a prolonged period of time or are taking advantage now, certainly the access or the opportunity to gain access into future further environments that are still not secure, right? So from there, depending on the attacker's motivation, they can wage any wide number of attacks and ultimately just maintain access into an environment, because this is the first step. And then it's really about the type of tactics, techniques, and procedures that we see so often, which means getting into a system via one mechanism or in an environment via one mechanism, and then really expanding access from there, moving laterally through the environment and gaining a foothold to other areas, which could have impact from ransomware attacks. We're certainly seeing a lot in the news about that already as a potential concern and some related activity based on where the threat's coming from. So the more quickly we can secure our environments, the better off we're going to be.
So I want to ask a question to both of you, but I'll start with Wendy. It seems like this has been going on almost every few months you have a major issue. A few months ago, it was the Microsoft vulnerability in Exchange. We've seen a lot of attacks recently, obviously with SolarWinds. What do companies need to do to kind of gear up, because this is happening over and over and over again? Wendy, again to you. What should they be doing to get ready for the next one?
Well, yeah, Rob, I think this really underscores just the delicate ecosystem we have of all of these interdependent technologies, because it's not only systems that are within your environment, but it's potentially, systems that our providers are using, our supply chain is using. And so the ramifications become bigger. But first and foremost, I think the best way to deal with this and future situations like this is really to ensure that we've got good basic hygiene in place. We've always talked about the need to be patching systems effectively, and this is certainly underscored here, right? The need to be able to identify quickly what do we have in our environment, what systems are dependent upon which pieces of software, and how do we quickly secure those as much as possible. From there, it's really a defense in depth strategy, right? Making the assumption that someone is going to get into your environment that is not a credible user at some point in time. And so from there, we want to do things like limit their ability to effectively move laterally, limit their ability to execute code in other parts of the environment, to download sensitive software. So all of those things become critically important in a time like this.
So Ankur, same question to you, but actually, since you focus a lot on cloud, I mean, in the cloud world, we see a lot of change. I mean, Flux is the norm. How do companies handle this in that kind of environment?
Yeah, it's a great question, because what is unique about the cloud is the cloud workloads are like cattle, not pets. They're highly dynamic in nature. So if you've got the old type of patching system, it simply does not scale and work. So just to kind of double click on what Wendy mentioned, the things that organizations should do, it's like having a security system to protect your house, to continuously monitoring your environment for bad actors. In the cloud environment, what it specifically means is that you got to be continuously monitoring your applications for vulnerabilities. Open source is everywhere. Developers are downloading package from everywhere on the web. So you want to make sure that you're scanning your runtime environments for vulnerabilities like Log4j, but it could be anything else. But the more important thing is to shift left, because at the speed at which developers are building applications in the cloud, you got to have security where the developers are, and make sure that it is built into the application pipeline. That means, scan your code when it's in the source code repo, scan the code when it's in your container registries, and have guardrails. Critical vulnerability will not ever go into production. You got to have that type of control. And then to Wendy's point, have defense in depth. In case something were to go into production, you got to have preventative control, like a web application and API security that is meant for cloud, not sort of legacy type approaches. So make sure you have preventative control. And even in spite of that, somebody gets in, once again, have more advanced detection capabilities to identify the bad actors and lateral movement.
So quick reminder to everyone watching, feel free to ask questions. I will relay any interesting questions to the panel here. Ankur, let's stick with you for a second. In terms of how to staff for something like this, right? This is the mother of all fire drills. How do you gear up from a staffing perspective? As a small company, as a large company, is there anything you see in best practices from your experiences?
Absolutely. I think this whole thing starts with DevOps, developer, and security partnership. There are 26 million developers, and there are 3 million security professionals. Number of breaches and exploits and vulnerabilities is only going to rise. And the idea that you'll continue to have centralized security teams and SOC teams inundated with this is just simply not scalable. There are just not enough security professionals out there. So the way you want to staff this up is, shift as much responsibility as possible to the left. Make sure that DevOps teams and developers are trained and aware of the type of security vulnerability that can happen. And then only have the classic security organization, the SOC teams, engaged for more advanced scenarios where somebody were to exploit this vulnerability and exfiltrate the data or use your critical workloads for things like crypto mining, etc. But the best way to staff this is to train more and more developers. If you have 26 million developers trained, chances are that you're going to minimize problems like this in future.
So Wendy, in your background history as an incident responder, threat researcher, what are some of the best practices you've seen from how companies staff up when they have urgent issues like this?
Oh yeah, certainly having access, I think first and foremost is having a clearly defined plan that you can put in place at any point in time when an activity like this occurs. So this is something we do while working with our internal teams here at Palo Alto Networks on a daily basis. And every time we have one of these opportunities, we use that to iterate on the plan and then identify areas where, hey, we could have done this faster, or we could have communicated more interconnectedly between these different teams. That's fundamental and so critical. And I think oftentimes we think of this just in terms of when a breach occurs, but ultimately it's having a playbook in place that the team and the organization across a multitude of stakeholders within your organization can execute on, and where people understand what their roles and responsibilities are, and then how to escalate. Certainly as part of that, it's really important to have a process that you can up level to, that's not part of the daily approval process, that allows the organization to make communications decisions faster and to take action faster. So as part of that, knowing when and where you need to escalate and potentially say, okay, we've now got a situation that requires external resources. When that's the case, certainly having those contracts in place in advance so that you can surge, bring in the expert support you need when you need it is absolutely critical. And then the last thing I would say, have relationships in advance with law enforcement, with vendors who can provide threat intelligence information, and peer organizations who can also share information from a threat intelligence perspective about what's working, what's not, and really help your organization respond much more efficiently and contain any problems faster.
So Wendy, kind of similar on that same note, boards of directors, CEOs, they're going to be asking a lot about this. From your experience, what kind of information, what kind of things do they want to see to feel comfortable like, yes, we've got this under control?
Yeah, I think, first and foremost is does the organization have the visibility to answer the question that the board is going to ask? And in a situation like this, it's incredibly complex because we're talking about different types of software across a multitude of vendors. And that's the most difficult question, I think, for most organizations to answer now is just, where exactly are we exposed? And first and foremost, how can we prevent any exploits taken against us from being successful? So from that perspective, I think it's critical to have honest conversations with the board about the level of visibility and potentially what improvements need to be made moving forward. But I do think this is going to drive different conversations because we've been talking now, certainly for the last 18 months, just about the perpetuation of these supply chain attacks. But I think the reality is this is really exposing how challenging it is to manage this interconnected ecosystem of different types of technology. So from that perspective, that will have real financial impact that boards of directors are going to be asking about. They're also going to certainly be interested in what kind of regulatory and compliance and notification concerns come from this. So certainly being able to answer those questions and proactively provide those answers to the board is extremely critical in a situation like this.
So Ankur, a question for you similar to that. You're dealing with a lot of companies that are undergoing a move to a cloud, digital transformation. If you're talking to a CEO or board member about this vulnerability and what it means for people in that journey, what should they be conveying to their management?
Yeah, I think Wendy touched upon a lot of the key points here already. As you move to the cloud and are moving fast, the important thing here is once again, just have a continuous monitoring in place, shifting security left. Identify these problems early and often. Like I said, in source code repo, container registries, etc. A lot of what Wendy talked about is that, in spite of all your attempts, if, things kind of fall through, you need to have systems and procedures in place to address that. But my advice to everybody who's going to the cloud or otherwise is to have a really good hygiene about continuous monitoring, vulnerability management. And I think board is going to want to know out of the cloud applications, how many of them are using Log4j component version 2.15 or otherwise. Understand that how many of those workloads are internet exposed, so we're exploitable. And then a clear mitigation plan if and when these systems are going to get patched.
So I have a good question from the audience from Hirosh. What kind of approach can people take quickly to address the issues, since there are multiple solutions that are multiple things that have been exposed? Let's start with you, Wendy.
Well, yeah, I think first and foremost is making sure you can block the exploit effectively. So having the visibility in place to detect when that's occurring, and having the right technology in place to stop the effective execution. Second, I would say identification of vulnerable applications. This is probably the most time-consuming component of this, but certainly the most critical so that we can prevent any future impact moving forward. Next, I would say just determining if any systems within your environment have already been compromised. Again, that requires visibility and certainly the processes and procedures and right people on your team to be able to answer those questions quickly, and then to determine what actions need to be taken if that's the case. If that is the case, and certainly preventing and containing the spread of any additional lateral movement and remediating those systems that have already been identified as potentially compromised.
Thank you. Okay, and then, oh, you want to go ahead? Go ahead, Ankur.
Yeah, no, I was just going to double click on what Wendy said. So I think more specifically, the mitigation here sort of falls into buckets, preventative controls and detection technologies, right? So like first part of this is detect, how many of your applications have this vulnerability. So just understanding your sort of surface area, the things that you need to patch. The second thing is obviously to detect if there was an exploit, indeed or not, like just make sure you stop the bleeding. But I think the more important thing is to then put preventative control, which comes in sort of three flavors. One is to make sure that any packages or any images that have this vulnerability don't get deployed in production. So you're going to stop the bleeding, make sure nothing happens. Second thing is that on the preventative side, you should have a web application firewall type technology where anytime there's an HTTP payload coming in with a specific characteristics, JNDI or otherwise, you're able to stop that. Make sure you have that in place as well. And then you can use other techniques like having firewalls, et cetera, to make sure that you have the preventative control to ensure that, this doesn't happen anymore.
Okay, we have another question from Prasant, who wants to know a little bit more about how the exploit works, specifically a little bit around how the return traffic occurs. So, Ankur, why don't we start with you on that one?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the just a high level, and I know this is a CISO level conversation, but I'll go a little bit technical. The way this happens is fairly straightforward, actually. A bad actor can send a curl or just an HTTP request with a specific payload, JNDI, which will have a directory server address. And this directory server is owned by the bad actor. The Log4j component sitting within your application will readily and happily accept that request and say, okay, well, I've been told to connect to this directory server that's then controlled by this malicious actor. And this bad actor would have this, URL also with base 64 encoding. So just to sort of, if you have like some sort of a mitigation control, it's just going to bypass it. And then once the application knows it needs to connect to this directory server, it follows suit. And then there, the bad actor is going to want a piece of software that gets downloaded on the system. And then, they can ask for a shell access, RDP, whatever you have. And, if you don't have a good hygiene around, identity and SSH, you are prone to having lateral movement as well. You get access to one EC2 instance or compute, then you can move laterally and pretty much compromise a good chunk of your infrastructure and applications.
So, Wendy, let's go over to you. I have a question around the attackers. What are you seeing right now from the threat research side in terms of what people are doing from an attack standpoint? Are they going in specific areas, specific attack methods? Give us a sense of the threat landscape as it pertains to this vulnerability today.
Yeah, a great question, Rob. So I think, first and foremost, we need to remember that attackers are opportunistic, and a vulnerability like this gives a wide array of attackers the opportunity to gain further access and maintain footholds into a huge number of environments. So that's really the opportunistic piece of this, is identifying, hey, how quickly can I get into environments that I potentially didn't have an avenue into before? So that said, it really ranges from everyone from those opportunistic criminals to the more advanced cyber criminals who are focused on financially motivated crimes, and then certainly to nation states. I think, a big question that remains to be seen is right now, we don't know how long and whom had access to this prior to the vulnerability being disclosed. So from that perspective, I would make, as a responder and a bit of a pessimist, I guess, I would make the statement that most everybody is likely exposed to this. And our goal then is going to be to contain that exposure as quickly as possible. From the attack landscape, we've certainly already started seeing some indications of nation state actors scanning for this and having a foothold in environments already. We've also seen from a cyber criminal perspective and are anticipating a next wave of ransomware attacks to come from that. But again, I think we're saying that there's a difference between the actions we're taking today and then the lifetime of this, the exposure from this vulnerability. So whether that's months or years, ideally we are going to contain that as quickly as we can so we can start limiting that. But the real answers are going to be clearly coming to us, I think, over the next months when we start seeing the attacks that are leveraged as a result of this.
Wendy, how easy is it to exploit this? Maybe you can put us through the lens of the attacker and walk us through just like, what are they doing right now?
Yeah, as Encore mentioned, and I think he can really go into detail on that, but the reality is this is a really easy to use. And so that's where, from an investigative perspective, it really gives us pause from the perspective of this can have so many different types of attackers that are taking advantage of this. Certainly, this is really child's play for any well-funded attacker, but from those that are more opportunistic and just getting in the game, it's relatively easy to be sending these payloads to different exposed organizations and entities, and then at least getting a basic foothold within the environment. So Encore, maybe I'll turn it to you to go into detail about the specifics of how those payloads are sent.
Yeah, I think, I went over some of that already, right? I think the specific payload is, JNDI, which is a directory naming lookup service within, kind of the Java component. Followed by, again, a directory server IP address. So you're going to look out for that. So if you've got a web application firewall, sort of born in the cloud type, you want to have, if you're going to introduce a preventative control, make sure that you're looking out for that specific payload so that any web traffic that's coming your way gets stopped right then and there. And this actor doesn't have the opportunity to exploit this vulnerability.
Excellent, thank you. Actually, maybe Ankar, let's stick with you.
Yeah.
Give us a little bit of color. What can Palo Alto Networks do to help companies mitigate against this particular vulnerability?
Yeah, look, I think first and foremost, we're here to help, like in any capacity. You don't need to buy any products from us, nothing from us. Let us know. As the cybersecurity leader in the industry, we have a responsibility. We want to make sure this couldn't have happened at a more inopportune time around the holidays. So I know that there's a lot of hurt in the system right now among the security and application professionals. So let us know how we can help, right? Like we've obviously published blog posts, more educational pieces, less about the product. But just know that if you are a Palo Alto customer, we have a slew of products that can already help you know that you're covered. If you're using Prisma Cloud from vulnerability scanning, preventative control, web application and API, all of that is already available. We've already applied virtual patches. If you're a Cortex customer, and if somebody's trying to explore this, we have detection techniques and technology. If you're a firewall customer, with a virtual firewall, physical, Prisma Access, you practically don't even have to do anything because we already have the threat IDs associated with this and know that the firewalls will block this. But, again, less about the product. We just generally, as the thought leaders, we want to help in whatever shape or form. But we obviously have the product lines that provides, like Wendy says, defense in depth from monitoring, detection, and prevention perspective.
Wendy, question for you.
Well, yeah. Hey, Rob, I was just going to expand a bit on what Encore said. I know this is a bit doom and gloom, right, in terms of we've got another major potential vulnerability and potential exploits. Like at the holiday season, this is not a great time. But also, I don't know that there's actually been a time where public and private partnerships have been more effective, where they're more effectively sharing information about threat indicators, IOCs, and collections that organizations can operationalize immediately. I don't think that's actually ever been more rapid. So, seeing the efforts that DHS and CISA in particular have taken, certainly in partnership with so many other organizations around the world, I think is pretty inspiring. So there's a lot of information. So I would say for organizations, I can imagine you're incredibly short-staffed. You don't have much time to respond to this and let alone do the rest of your day jobs. But really making sure that you've got those partnerships in place, you've got points of contact in those organizations is really critical, not only for this incident, but certainly moving forward.
So on a similar note, Wendy, let's stick with you. In terms of services support, what is Unit 42? What can they provide for companies who might find themselves short-staffed or short-skilled?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, just to expand on Ankur's comments, we're not here to try to be looking to sell more things to organizations, right? What we're looking to do is first and foremost share intelligence that organizations can use to operationalize quickly and detect this as fast as they can and take actions. That said, if you do find yourself in need of additional support, we are on standby at all hours of the day to work with organizations to, whether it's the identification of your attack surface and needing to get a hold around which systems might potentially be vulnerable and get those patched, to certainly responding to compromised environments where we can quickly come in and help you contain as effectively as possible. We have a wide variety of services offered that are available to be reached at 24/7 capacity.
So, Wendy, we have a couple minutes left. Maybe I'll ask you a tough question, which is, if you were to prognosticate, look into your crystal ball for the next year or so, what can we expect from this vulnerability? How is it going to change cybersecurity? How will people look at it, at the industry, a little bit differently?
Yeah, great question. So, one is I think, unfortunately, we're going to continue to see some more of the same. So continued pace, which, I've been in this field 20 years and I don't think I've ever seen, right, the pace. And I say this, I think every month as I'm presenting and talking to clients, and it just continues to grow, right? So our pace continues to increase, to be more rapid. So the ability to detect threats has never been more critical than it is now. I think from the perspective of these types of attacks moving forward, this is going to be one of more to come. So understanding our supply chain risks and dependencies has also never been more critical. And then specific to the coming year, I think we're moving into, within the United States, midterm elections. And most likely you're going to see a lot of activity surrounding that in terms of the cyber environment. So I think that organizations really need to be prepared to put in resources that can work at this operational level, and then make sure that they've got resources they can depend on externally as well, so that you can maintain a manageable cadence.
And similar question for you, Ankur, but I also want to throw in a great question from Roy from the audience, which is, kind of give us a sense of what you think the future holds for us in cybersecurity. But what Roy is also asking is, we use a lot of open source. Open source obviously has a huge footprint in the world today. And, how should we be thinking about open source licensing, using open source inventory in the future?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, I must apologize. I know I went dark for a little bit. The joys of working from home, camera go off and on. Hopefully you can hear me all right. Look, 10 years ago, when I was a developer, it was 80% my code, 20% open source library. The reality is that developers have gone a little lazy nowadays. So it's 80% open source code and 20% libraries. And 20% rather their own code. The direct result of this is that you're going to see a ton of open source stuff across the web incorporated in your application. and you can't tell them to stop doing that. Like they're going to move fast. Once again, just to sort of repeat what I said, the way to solve this problem is to scan your open source library as they exist in your source code repo. And those libraries and your code turn into an image that goes to your registry, scan it there again. Make sure you have zero tolerance policy for especially critical and high vulnerability, so they never get deployed. And then even if they do, you have a continuous monitoring in production, in runtime that's taking place. That's your best bet right now. Asking developers to stop using open source is not an option. Security has to figure out a way to work with the current reality. And I think we've seen a lot of customers. I mean, we've seen thousands of customers use this pretty effectively, and make sure that vulnerable code doesn't make its way into production. It's achievable.
So I have one final question, and then we will actually close for today. But before I do that, I just want to make sure that everyone who's watching, make sure that you take a look in the comment section. We're going to be posting some resources, including our blog, which is a must-read. And in fact, if you do a search on this particular vulnerability, our Unit 42 blog is pretty much top in terms of popularity, so it's worth a read. Ankur, let's stick with you here. Any parting thoughts? Like, what's the one thing you would want our viewers to take away from our session today and from this episode?
Look, use this as a lesson, and I know it's sort of right now everybody's scrambling to patch this, and anything I say is going to seem like repeating the same thing over and over again. But I think it must be said again. Let this be an example to ensure that you are securing your CI/CD pipelines. Like it is super critical. Log4j is a very common component. A lot of the bad things will happen because of the stuff that is not as common potentially, right? So ensure that you have a good hygiene from build, deploy to runtime. Make sure you have a good security hygiene across your environment. But for now, over the next couple of months, your number one priority is to make sure that you patch your code with 2.16, which, by the way, was not the right fix. Looks like the 2.20 that's going to come out that does not have JNDI callback. Number one priority. And it sucks to have to do this during the holidays, but you got to patch your Log4j ASAP. That's the first order of priority. And then ensure that you have a good security hygiene.
Thank you, Ankur. Appreciate it. And then Wendy, any final thoughts from you before we close out?
Yeah, two things. So I think, I was going to reiterate exactly what Ankur said regarding good security hygiene. I think so many times when attacks are in the news and they become sensationalized, and we hear these stories about these, incredibly prolific attacks, but the reality is that good security hygiene will really provide the foundation needed to prevent the successful, not only exploitation, but just enable organizations to contain these attacks as quickly as possible. That's really what the win here is about. And then the second piece is, I think we also oftentimes get so wrapped up in the technical components of it that it's easy to forget that there's a human element on the other side, and that there are people in the world who are using these opportunities to make money, to steal additional data, maybe for a political objective. And the reality is that time isn't in our favor right now. So the more work we can do in the near term to limit our attack surface, the better. And certainly we understand that that's not an easy feat in this situation. Want to just thank the audience for joining us today. And certainly if you've got follow-on questions, we're here to answer them.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Ankur. With that, we appreciate your time today. Hopefully this was useful. Again, you can see all of our resources in the comments section. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions or any thoughts about this particular issue. In the meantime, we wish you the best in terms of dealing with this vulnerability, as well as happy holidays. So with that, thank you very much and have a good day.